In this video, we're going to learn about slopes of lines. The slope of a line is basically a measure of how steep a line is. In general, if a line has a large slope, it means that the line is very steep. Whereas if a line has a small slope, we would say that it is not very steep. In order to calculate the slope of a line, we need 2 points on the line. If we have 2 points, x1, y1, and x2, y2 on the graph of our line, then we calculate the slope of the line using the formula m equals y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. The letter m here is the letter that we typically use to denote the slope of a line. The numerator here is basically just the difference between the two y coordinates, and the denominator is the difference between the two x coordinates. Let's take a look at what this means for us visually. Suppose that we have a line that looks like this. Now, to find the slope, we need to have 2 points. Let's pick any 2 points on this line. Our first one here we'll label as x1, y1, and then our second point, let's pick it over here, we'll label this x2, y2. Let's try to understand the quantities in our slope formula. Let's start with that numerator, y2 minus y1. So if we look at our graph, y2 represents the vertical distance from the x-axis going all the way up to our second point. And y1 represents the vertical distance from the x-axis all the way to our first point. When we take the difference, y2 minus y1, we're essentially taking this long vertical length and we're removing this short vertical length. So let's take this y1 length, we'll move it closer to the y2 length to give us a sense of what this looks like when we take the difference. So when we do the difference, y2 minus y1, we're basically removing y1 from y2, and that leaves us with just this length, which we'll label here as y2 minus y1. Next, let's look at the denominator, x2 minus x1. Just like before, we can visualize these lengths. x2 would be the horizontal distance from the y-axis all the way to our second point, and x1 is the horizontal distance from the y-axis all the way to our first point. When we do x2 minus x1, we're essentially taking this longer horizontal length and we're removing this short horizontal length. So let's move that x1 closer to x2. That way we can see what it looks like when we take the difference. Removing x1 from x2, we end up with this horizontal length. So let's label that x2 minus x1. Now, to get a better sense of what these lengths are telling us, let's move that x2 minus x1 down over here. And we see that essentially x2 minus x1 is how much we go across to get from the first point to our second point, and y2 minus y1 is how much we go up to get from our first point to our second point. Now, these quantities are often referred to as the rise, which is how far we have to go up to get from one point to another, and the run, which is how much we have to go horizontally to get from one point to another. So if we go back to our slope formula, m equals y2 minus y1 divided by the x2 minus x1, we're essentially looking at the fraction of the rise divided by the run. Now let's try to understand why looking at this fraction tells us about how steep a line is. What we're going to do is we're going to look at 2 lines. In our first graph, let's look at a line that is very steep. Let's pick 2 points that are on this line and let's see what the rise and the run would look like. So the run is how far we go horizontally to get from one point to the next, and the rise is how much we go up vertically to get from one point to the next. From our picture, we see that the rise is much larger than the run. So when we look at the ratio of the rise over run, since the numerator is much larger than the denominator, this is going to be a large quantity. So when we have steep lines, we have large slopes. For our second example, let's look at a line with a very shallow incline, so a line that's not very steep. Again, we'll pick 2 points on this line, and we'll look at the rise and the run. Again, the run is how far we go across to get from the first point to the second point, and the rise is how far we have to go up to get from the first point to the second point. This time, our run is much larger than our rise. So in our fraction here, rise over run, we have a small quantity in the numerator and a large quantity in the denominator, which means that overall this fraction is going to be small. So in general, if your line is shallow instead of steep, your slope is going to be small. So we now have a rough understanding of what the slope of a line tells us. In our next video, we'll look at calculating the slopes of lines, and we'll also learn how to use the slope of a line to help us draw the graph.